Hey guys, it's IllumiGnostic, and for this video we're going to do a Q&A session, and we're going to talk about pretty much all of the, I'm going to answer a question from pretty much every subject that I cover on this channel. Do me a favor, hit the like button, subscribe, support us on Patreon. Speaking of support on Patreon, I want to thank Tamo. I'm not going to attempt the last name, but I want to thank him for becoming a Patreon supporter. I've been able to announce a new Patreon supporter in the last two videos, so we're pretty excited about that. And we definitely need your support. I know we're very close to monetization too, in terms of the time and subscribers, so I want to thank everybody that's subscribed. But I really want to encourage you to contribute on Patreon because of the nature of this channel. I'm not sure that we will get approved for monetization, and of course it's important. I can't really justify putting money into the YouTube channel that the YouTube channel did not generate. Okay, so some of these questions have come from various people. How did I get into shamanism and entheogens, from Thomas V? This is actually a long story. I began studying psychoactive plants in the second grade, and it was kind of a strange circumstance that led to that. I was obviously in elementary school, and I went to the library one day, and I saw a book, it was a very small book, called Flowering Plants. Pretty nondescript. It was just black with a heavenly blue morning glory, which of course contains LAD, which is a natural analog to LSD, which is interesting. It was the first time that a chemical was synthesized in a lab and then basically discovered in nature. LAD is very, very similar in structure to LSD. So at any rate, I think this book slipped onto the shelves because it just looked innocuous, and I mean, in my opinion, it was. But it had a lot of the folklore and traditional uses and descriptions of the effects of all of these things, and the interest kind of grew from there. I think by the time I was 14 or 15, I'd read the Psychedelics Encyclopedia 3 times, which is like 1,100 pages long or something. It was just an intuitive kind of fascination, and I really do believe in that several times in my life, and I think this is something that, you know, hopefully can be of value to people out there. If you've had these experiences, I would really encourage you to take them seriously. When I first, my mom, when I was, you know, maybe 9 or something, I don't even know why, but I asked her what a Gnostic was, and when she told me, you know, what she knew, I had this overwhelming feeling of like elation, and I'm like, I'm a Gnostic basically, which isn't exactly true. I'm definitely not a Christian Gnostic, but the idea of individually centered process of divine revelation is definitely central to everything I do, and you know, is my purpose with my work, to continue to develop that in myself and to encourage that development in others. And then all of this was before I'd ever experienced the psychedelic, obviously. I think I took LSD for the first time when I was 15, and I remember this today, actually. I remember walking through a tunnel, and I saw these characters that were just kind of moving, and I realized that these aren't really hallucinations. This is like a language, which is interesting if you know anything about Jewish mysticism, which later I would study because of my interest in Gnosticism and Freemasonry and all of these sort of Western esoteric and Eastern esoteric traditions. You know, the universe is made of letters in the Jewish mystical tradition, and each one of these letters also has a numerical value. This is what the science of gematria is all about. Eventually I'll make a video about that because I've actually had some pretty extraordinary experiences with gematria. And of course now we know that the world is basically generated by number. And that might be an oversimplification, but whenever I see something in mysticism that's reflected by science, that always raises my eyebrows. I think it's good to take note of those kinds of things. And of course, a number of years later, these letters, or hyperdimensional hieroglyphics, were painted by Alison Gray, the wife of the great artist Alex Gray, and of course a very great artist herself. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with a Terence McKenna quote, that if you know the words that the world is made out of, you can make of it what you want. The other thing that drew me to continue with this fascination with psychedelics was the fact that I was always obsessed with mystical ideas, with metaphysics, with I didn't understand how people could just go about their daily lives without asking these huge questions, or being kind of obsessed with them in the way that I was. I actually felt very alienated because of it. And I also knew that this kind of consumer-driven, material, deterministic view of the universe was leading us down a sort of nihilistic path that was very destructive and meaningless, and I could see the damage that it was doing, and I intuitively knew before I ever touched a psychedelic that it would be very important, and it would be the answer to this global predicament more than anything else. And it baffles me a bit even. I remember the first time I even heard LSD, my mom was yelling at my dad for having taken some. I was a really little kid, I had no idea what they were talking about, but when I heard those 3 letters, I literally sat up in bed. And I thought, whatever that is, I need to find it, because it's going to be important. So, over the years, I studied and studied. I did have a long period where, I became addicted to opiate painkillers because of a health problem that I had. It led to becoming dependent on these. And during that entire time period, I didn't use psychedelics again. It wasn't until I came to Ecuador. Right before that, I think I started taking LSD pretty regularly again with my band, because there's a lot of research that's been done recently, and I think I saw something about the enhanced neuroplasticity and how we could start to learn again as if we were a young child, and also to deprogram and reprogram habits away. I slowly started to reinvest myself in entheogens and plant medicine. And when I came down to Ecuador, drank ayahuasca finally, I experienced, tremendous healing. The shamans that I was working with recognized that I was guiding people, working with people. I actually ended up babysitting a couple of very good shamans that had made some very potent medicine, and I was able to handle it and they weren't. And so eventually, this led to one of the shamans saying to me, you're becoming a shaman, and he gave me some practical instruction. And of course I've been studying forever, but book knowledge is a little bit different than actual practice. And since then, I've done a lot of ceremonies with people, some of them that I've led, and time and time again, people experience. I think every single ceremony, I've seen somebody experience a huge healing, resolution of some kind of conflict, finding direction. I've seen nihilists and atheists and materialists suddenly develop a spiritual dimension instantaneously. And so it's very exciting. It's very exciting to look. I was just watching before we started making this video. I'm actually going to post a link to this other video in the comments. It's probably the best documentary that I've ever seen. It's basically just a panel of neuroscientists and anthropologists and the like. I think a psychologist, child psychologist, kind of talking about what they've learned about psychedelics. And it's interesting to see their limitations, though. And I think that somehow we have to figure out how to transcend these limitations with science. For example, they did acknowledge that even though all of these different compounds work on the same neurotransmitters, they have drastically different effects and personalities. And one neuroscientist said, we don't really have any good explanation for that particular phenomenon. Also, another thing that I've noticed that I think is very disturbing about this, the main benefit, I think, of plant medicine and psychedelics is the experience of transcendental unity. And ayahuasca has been well documented by anthropologists, explorers. Sir Walter Raleigh had written about it. Remote viewing has been documented very regularly for at least 150 years now, and I'm talking about just by Europeans. I'm sure this stuff has been known in the jungles for thousands of years. But I think it's very different for a person to say, well, intuitively, I believe in this transcendental unity. But having actually experienced it undeniably is extremely important. I do have a video called Ayahuasca and Telepathy where I talk about this a little more, but the point that I'm getting at here is that I know that the researchers were aware of this in the 60s because Masters in Houston, a couple of PhD researchers in the early 60s, did some experiments with ayahuasca, and they were able to confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt telepathy. And this has also confused me that nobody has managed to claim that guy that has the $500,000 prize if you can prove any kind of sixth sense. Apparently they have never interacted with an ayahuasquero in his own turf, because I think that money would be collected pretty quickly. I'll give just a real quick example. I mean, I've literally been, sitting on a porch thinking about something and open my eyes and the shaman is next to me, giving me insight. It's exactly precisely the thing that I'm thinking about. Another time I fell asleep not asleep, but closed my eyes, in the ayahuasca trance state. And I had the distinct impression that I could see through my forehead. The mosquito landed, I could see it, I could see the railing on the deck. And the first thing the shaman says to me the next morning when I woke up was, by the way, you can sometimes see through your forehead on the medicine. This kind of stuff, it happens constantly at these ceremonies, particularly if you have someone who's a shaman who's very sensitized to this collective consciousness that you can experience. So it's really exciting to see all the progress that's being made. I certainly didn't really expect that this would happen. I hoped but didn't expect, because I really do think that the consciousness catalyzation that comes from psychedelics is just about our only hope at this point. So I hope that answers your question sufficiently, Thomas. The next question: do you believe that consciousness creates reality, and to what extent, and can psychedelics contribute to this capacity? From Baphomet 667. I guess 667 is the number of the neighbor of the beast. Yes, I mean, this is a very difficult question to get into. I think, but from you can speak about it from different levels. From the pragmatic materialist level, absolutely, consciousness is going to create your reality. If your beliefs are limiting, if your beliefs are expansive, even without getting too esoteric or mystical, I think just from a psychological standpoint, this is definitely, absolutely, your state of mind is everything. And I mean, I think any life coach or guru or anyone is going to tell you that. But from a more esoteric standpoint, I do think that consciousness has an influence on the energy that makes up our realities. I think it's very important, though, when you get into this kind of thinking, to remember that there are limitations, and those limitations seem to be determined by the parameters of natural law. So, I'm always saying, it's not that magic isn't real, it's just that people are always trying to do impossible things, and then they don't succeed for obvious reasons. Also, I think that magic is basically a branch of physics when properly understood. And I don't think that most people would go to a large hadron collider and try to operate it and fail, and then say that physics isn't real or some equivalent. If you tried to build a spaceship, you probably wouldn't succeed. That doesn't mean that no one can build a spaceship. So I think also that has happened a lot, because you have failed at magic means that it's not real. And obviously that's kind of an egocentric delusion, I think. And when I talk about magic, I specifically mean the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So, I can tell you a few examples. You can watch my Danny Carey video. I decided I really wanted to talk to this guy, the drummer from Tool, a huge rock star, could have been anywhere on the planet. And I literally drove right to him and had a conversation with him. There are certain musicians that I wanted to play with that it was like the probability of this happening was like next to nothing. And I did it anyways. There was another instance where, there was a band, Dark Star Orchestra, that I really wanted. I said to my wife, my ex-wife, I wish they would have like a school where they taught, the mechanisms of this music and stuff. And a week later, she hands me her phone, and there's like this Dark Star Orchestra high school thing, And I'm not saying I necessarily generated all that, but I think the relationship that consciousness has with energy is only beginning to be understood. And so the second half of the question, can psychedelics contribute to this capacity? Absolutely. And I think that it's very helpful to look at the modern research to understand, to have a framework for the Western mind to really see this, so that you're working with something more akin to certainty and not so much faith and intuitive belief. I do put a lot of stock into intuition, but I think it's we want a holistic approach. And so a lot of brain scans have been done, people on different psychedelics, and what they're discovering basically is that there is much more random activity, which actually doesn't mean the brain is just kind of firing everywhere and going nuts. it's experimenting with more states at once, I think is how the neuroscientist in this video put it. But basically, you're using more of your brain than you normally are. And you're open to a greater range of possibilities. And so if you go through life believing that something isn't there, actually I'll give you an even more down-to-earth example of this. Mushroom hunters have this experience all the time, and it happened to me the first time I went looking for morel mushrooms, for azarescens, the exact same experience where we couldn't find them, and as soon as one of us saw one, we turned around and looked, and they were everywhere. It's just that we couldn't see them until we saw one. And in the case of the morels, we're not talking about like little things buried in the grass. Once we found the first one, which was small, when we turned around and looked, they were in plain sight everywhere. I mean, it almost doesn't make sense, but I think everything in life is like this. You miss out on synchronicities. There are all sorts of miraculous things that happen, but if you are closed off to these possibilities, then you have no chance of experiencing them, or very little chance. So since the psychedelics expand, your cognitive faculties and make the brain itself physically more open to interpreting more phenomenology, you're absolutely going to be empowered to at least experience a greater depth and breadth of existence. And I think that also particularly something like DMT, which in my opinion is somehow some sort of equivalent of like crystallized consciousness. And if the universe is truly made of consciousness, and our consciousness has the capacity to manipulate energy, when you smoke DMT, you are temporarily empowering your consciousness to generate these things and to crystallize your thoughts. And I've experienced this to a degree. It's very difficult, even with my very skeptical mind. It's very difficult for me to deny the things that I've seen and experienced, and they do seem to increase directly after experiences with ayahuasca and DMT. As well as the other faculties of the brain with psilocybin as well. I've seen long-range telepathy that absolutely could not be denied. So most definitely. How did you get into Freemasonry, random devil? That's also a long and convoluted story. But basically, when I was younger, I kind of felt like just intuitively there was something there for me. I read a book called the IllumiGnostic trilogy. I think this is probably by Robert Anton Wilson, probably the biggest catalyst that pushed me to study the Western mystery schools and the esoteric traditions in depth, and really devote myself to it and really get committed. I'd strongly recommend that book to anyone. You have to read it 3 times if you have any hope of understanding it. Timothy Leary said it was more important than Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which is quite the statement if you're familiar with that book. And speaking of remote viewing or phenomena that are difficult to explain, he actually lived to see this. He wrote about an Illuminati pyramid at the bottom of a very deep part of the ocean and gave the coordinates in the book, and it was actually in 2003 or 2004, right before his death, that pyramid was actually discovered right in that spot at the bottom of the ocean. And there, if you look up interviews with Robert Anton Wilson, they actually asked him about that before he died, and I mean that's an extraordinary thing to live to see. And I think there are a lot of things like that potentially in the book. 9/11 is described pretty explicitly. Black flag operations designed to take away the rights of the people. This book was written in 1974. So I noticed this brilliant man that also had an interest in psychedelics also seemed to know a whole lot about these mystery schools. So that was another major impetus. So fast forward many years later, when I went through the Phoenix process, which is going to be my next video, I was in a state of rapid spiritual development. I had a dream, this book I was looking for that was formerly a secret book of the Masons, written by Albert Pike, who was the highest ranking Mason in the United States at the time that the book was written. I dreamed that it was in a bookstore. I told my ex-girlfriend, let's go, and I told her what book, where we were going to get it, what happened in the dream, and sure enough, we walked in there and pulled it off the shelf. It's probably sitting right around here somewhere now. So, it's like I was guided every step of the way. The same thing happened with the Kabbalion, which is like related material. So eventually I ended up actually taking initiation in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was founded in 1888 by 2 33rd degree Freemasons, McGregor Mathers and S.L. Little, I think his name was. And of course, Aleister Crowley was one of the early members. And I took initiation in that, and a lot of the things that the adepts higher up in the organization did some pretty impressive things, and I realized that the Western esoteric tradition, as I suspected, was definitely no joke. So a few years after joining the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, I actually had an opportunity to join the main body of Freemasonry, the one that's recognized as the Scottish Rite. And that also was a pretty pivotal thing because, I wasn't really absolutely sure I had all these ideas, and one day I was talking to the master of the temple, who was like an ex-cop and 32nd degree, and everyone else in the temple was a 3rd degree, and I was telling him what I thought I'd figured out and stuff, and he just stopped me and said, "You know more about this than any of these men in this lodge." And so that was pretty wild because, and I'm not trying to impress anybody, I'm just trying to express to you what is possible through downloads and intuition, because all of the stuff that I'd figured out, it's not like I'd really read it anywhere, there's nowhere to read it. It was all just like, it had been bubbling up into my mind since I was a small child, and I have a lot of ideas about how that works, and eventually we'll make a video on that too. But yeah, that's basically long and short about how I got into Freemasonry. I mean, I noticed that most of the most powerful men in the world seemed to be affiliated with it, and that it was some kind of esoteric knowledge, and I figured that whatever that power is that they have, if we're going to change the world, we need to take it from them and use it ourselves, kind of a fight fire with fire sort of strategy. Do you think Donald Trump could be a prophet? Why do people always make a chemical experience into spiritual woo? From Jake E. I don't think that that's true. I have seen this week at least 2 people that were totally materialist. One of them was a nihilist, no spiritual dimension at all, have an experience with plant medicine that, within moments they had changed their view and their outlook. I am a pretty skeptical person myself. A lot of people have told me, the things that you've experienced, the degree of skepticism that you still have is almost frightening, it's almost too much. And so, I have a hard time with a psychedelic compound putting people into touch with disincarnate intelligences, and it's a lot to swallow. But I would say that the fact that, even researchers that were not taking DMT, that were interacting with people that were, became convinced that they were, that a veil between worlds had basically been rent, and they were communicating with things that had some sort of objective, independent objective existence. So I think it's unfortunate that people still think like that. I can see why you might, I guess, but I think that maybe whoever, that Jake should maybe, try to have a couple of breakthroughs on DMT, and this is something that must be experienced to be understood. So I guess that's my input on that one. And what do you think the greatest problem afflicting the United States is currently? Tom Yu. Cognitive dissonance, I would say. One of the things that the most valuable lessons I've learned from plant medicine, also getting out of the United States, so I could sort of, look at it from the outside, extricate myself from it. That's given me a much clearer view. But I think it's unfortunate that more people don't know about neurobiology and neurochemistry, because what happens is, if you've had a thought, neural pathways connected, the longer that connection has been there, the more difficult it is to break and rewire. And this is one of the hugest benefits of the neuroplasticity. that comes from, or the neuroplasticity is one of the biggest benefits of the psychedelic experience, because I think the conscious mind can even learn that this thinking is wrong, but maintain the old wrong thinking, because these neural pathways have been sort of hardwired from years and years and years of believing in these systems. And there are techniques for breaking it down, but you have to be willing. And I think getting over the ego, which is another thing that psychedelics help, ego dissolution, people talk about that over and over again. Although I should say as a caveat that the biggest danger of DMT is actually ego inflation, which I've seen quite a few times as well. But for the most part, ego dissolution. And so if you have the courage and the humility to realize that your brain may need some rewiring, for example, just the belief in voting in the democratic process in the United States to affect change after you've been through, however many presidents, and the agenda politically seems to be exactly the same. When you have one puppet enact a bunch of, say, environmental regulations to protect the environment, the next puppet comes along and throws them all away. And this has happened over and over again. It's not a coincidence, it's by design. The point is that if you still believe in something that you can tell is totally irrational, then you have cognitive dissonance, and you need to do something about it. So I think that fundamentally the problem in the United States is that psychedelics are not necessarily a part of the culture in the way that they are in the Amazon rainforest, where everyone understands that they're part of a collective mind, a collective being, and the neuroplasticity is maintained from the state of childhood, because as soon as it starts to congeal, generally the initiation at 15 or 16 with the psychedelic plants, or even younger in some tribes, and a lot of tribes actually, they start consuming ayahuasca as babies. So this never really happens to them. And I think that the disconnect with Western and European societies comes from the fact that we do not have these plant medicines integrated into our life. So I'm going to try to do one of these once a week. So if you guys want to drop your questions and comments in the comment section below, that would be great. Like, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. Thanks.